So this is our ecology portion, and so we're going to talk about behaviors of animals, and we'll kind of dabble in it with human behavior as well. But there's different ways that you can observe behavior, and that's, the first one is to actually just observe it and look at it, because, organisms have to interact with their environments in order to get what they need. And so we have internal factors that shape how our animal behaves, and we also have those external environments that affect those individual organisms. So the definition of behavior is how an animal responds to a stimuli in its environment. A lot of times in labs, we'll use stimuli as a food source. So you probably have heard of rats going through mazes, and at the end they get a reward or some kind of treat. But when we look at this behavior, it can be, it's actually more complex than what it really is. So we're going to look at how the organism perceives and processes information, and then how that information triggers some type of motor response, and then we kind of tie it into behavior. So our first example, well, sorry, I guess it's the next slide here, but like I said, there are different ways to study behavior. And so we look at the how does it all work? The animal senses something, there's nerve networks involved because it has to perceive and analyze that information. What kind of internal state is it in? So the how kind of questions causation. The why is the adaptive value. Why do it? And so a lot of times the why ties into survival or some type of reproductive success. And all of, both of these tie into evolutionary origins. So this is actually, there's a lot of controversy when we look at behavior, because is it determined by genes? Is it determined by its learning from its parents, or maybe some type of experience? Or is it instinct? You know how animals, they just instantly know what to do even though they've never been taught that? Or is it by experience? So there's, this back and forth. Is it nature? Is it nurture? But the bottom line is both do play a role in that final behavior. So one type of behavior is called innate, which is kind of like your instinct. We tend to think of these behaviors as stereotypical because they are basically handed down through natural selection. So there might be some kind of genetic background to innate behaviors. How does a mother duck know when to care for its young, or nest and know what it needs to do, etc.? How does it know where it needs to migrate, when it needs to migrate? So here's one example, the egg retrieval in geese. So geese, they incubate their eggs in a nest. Then the goose will notice that maybe an egg has been knocked out of that nest. So then what it will do is it will extend its neck toward the egg and then get up and then roll it back using the side-to-side motion back to the nest. And so if we were to analyze this behavior, and I have a video on the next slide that shows this, we have a sign stimulus. The goose says, oh, wow, look, the egg is out of the nest. So that's the signal that triggers the behavior. We have an innate release and mechanism. Natural selection provides instructions for the motor program. So it detects, hey, I should go retrieve that egg. And then it finally goes through this fixed action pattern, which means that the egg has been retrieved. So it's a stereotypical act. And this was observed in geese all across the board. So here's a video of it. This way. Gets up, rolls it back. Okay. Now, there's an interesting note, because they're like, well, is it just for eggs? What if I used a different object? Well, the sign stimuli is not very specific, so other objects will trigger that fixed action pattern. So the scientists or the ecologists started to roll baseballs in close proximity of the nest, as well as beer cans, and the geese went out to retrieve them even though they weren't eggs. And then once these objects are brought back to the nest, the goose recognizes that they are not eggs and then will remove them. So it retrieves it because it's like, oh, that's my egg, and then rolls it back, and it's like, wait, no, it's not, and then it discards it.
Will it retrieve it again and rolling away?
I don't know. Probably not. Okay, another example, male stickleback fish. So during the breeding season, males, they have this bright red colorization. They are very territorial. They will act aggressively towards other males. And the only reason why researchers noticed this is this was over in England. Their mail trucks are red. And so he had his fish tank by a window. And every time this mail truck drove by, the fish would get super aggressive and like attack it. And he's like, what's going on here? And then he realized, okay, so there's red colorization. Like anything that's red that's near this male, it gets very defensive. He also noticed that there was something called the supernormal stimuli involved, because then he started to test it against other objects that were red, and in this case, size. And so when given a choice, we have two stimuli. One's normal size, one's much larger. Many animals will respond to the larger of the two. You can kind of think of this as, going back to the geese, a normal goose egg versus one the size of a volleyball. It will respond to the volleyball before it actually responds to the normal goose egg. So here's a video that depicts this. Oh no.
Viciously attacking.
Okay, hold on. I got this video saved on here. So.
Chris Johnson, please come to the office. Chris Johnson.
Oh, that was just a really long start. Okay, here we go. So it's not reacting because there's no red.
It's looking better.
Okay. Okay. Moving on to behavioral genetics. So maybe there's a genetic side to behavior. And so some evidence that kind of supports this is rats. Rats were artificially selected for learning capacity. So in the 1940s, rats, they were training rats to go through a maze, and if they got through the maze, they got a reward. And they noticed that some rats learned very quickly, and others took a much longer time to learn the maze. So then what the scientists did is they bred the fast learners with one another, and so then they started to establish this maze-bright colony of rats. And the offspring of the maze-bright colony were faster than the parents. And then they also bred the slow learners, and they had a maze-dull colony, and the maze-dull colony were slower than parents, so maybe there's genetics with, learning tied into genetics. Okay, so here's a diagram showing these two with the maze dull and the number of errors that they had, and it just keeps increasing with each generation. And here's the maze bright, and you notice they made less mistakes as generations went on. Now there's a lot of controversy with this. There's this great book out there called The Mismeasure of Man, because can it be tied to humans? So yeah, it's a great book. Lots of controversies with it when you apply it to humans. Human twin studies also reveal similarities dependent on the independence of their environment. There have been case studies where we've had identical twins. They were raised in the same environments. And then they started to analyze their similarities in behavior, and they're trying to figure out if it was genetic similarity or if it was due to different environmental experiences. They've also had case studies where they took twins, they separated them at birth, they raised them in different families, maybe different social economic situations. And even though they were separated at birth, there was lots of similarities in personality, temperament, and leisure time activities, even though they had a different environment. So genetics, yes, do play a role, but it's still hotly debated because we've had cases where twins that were separated and in two different environments were completely different. So, like I said, lots of information out there. You're gonna have to form your own conclusion. Some behaviors do seem to be controlled by a single gene. And so both Drosophila and mice have mutations with a particular behavioral abnormality. So with fruit flies, there's a single gene that results in different feed and behavior in larvae. So if they have one allele, they move around a great deal as they eat, and if they have this different allele, they hardly move at all when they eat, and it's all because of one gene. In the mice, one mutation can lead to trouble remembering information that was learned 2 days earlier. And the reason for that is that gene produces an enzyme in the hippocampus, and if that gene is altered, then that enzyme doesn't really get produced. So it's this enzyme, and I think your book lists it. It's really important for spatial learning. Oh yes, here it is, nitric oxide. Oh, these are different examples, my bad. Okay, so there's other mutations where if the mice doesn't have nitric oxide, it's more aggressive. There's another gene called the FOSB gene that determines whether or not the females will nurture their young. I've shown you that website, Utah Genetics, Lick Your Pups, where that mother rat was licking its young, and it was going to determine if the rat was going to be calm or if it was going to be nervous. I think you remember that, right? Yeah. And had that weird sound effect. So, yes. Okay. Moving on to learning. Definition of learning is that the animals will alter the behavior as a result of previous experiences. So the first type of learning I want to talk about is habituation, which is called non-associative learning. And what happens with this is that there's a decrease in a response to a repeated stimulus, and there's no positive or negative consequences. So basically you have a strong stimulus at the start, but then as you continue with that response, their response also declines with repeated exposure. So you can kind of think of maybe a jack-in-a-box the first time it startles you, but then after you've had repeated exposure to it, maybe you don't jump as much anymore. So one example in birds, many young birds see many types of objects moving overhead. And so their first response, they'll crouch low and they'll stay still because maybe it's a predator or something. Objects that are moving overhead, we have leaves, we have other birds that are flying, and pretty soon they start to see these objects very frequently, and these objects don't have a positive or negative consequence. So then over time, the bird adapts to the stimuli and it stops responding. So it just learns not to respond to that stimuli. And so they learn to ignore unimportant stimuli so they can focus on other important activities like maybe finding food or avoiding predators, etc. The other type of learning, so that was non-associative. This is associative learning, where we're going to change the behavior because we're going to associate it with a stimulus and a response. So this behavior is conditioned through that association, and this is a little bit more complex than habituation. So there's two major types. Classical conditioning is the first type. This is the Pavlov's dog. So we're going to pair two different kinds of stimuli, causes the animal to form an association between the stimuli. So presented meat powder to the dog is the unconditioned stimulus. The dog salivates. That's the unconditioned response. So there's the first stimulus. That's the response. Now, if we put it in an unrelated stimulus, in this case, ringing a bell, so we ring the bell and we give the meat powder to the dog salivates. And now pretty soon the dog associates the ringing bell with meat powder. So then pretty soon it will become conditioned to just the bell alone without the meat powder. And so my education professor, he was so cruel, he brought Sour Patch Kids to school. And we were having a discussion, and any time he hit a bell, he'd give everyone a Sour Patch Kid, or and he just did this throughout the lecture. And the last 5 minutes, he'd ring the bell, and then our mouths salivated. I kid you not. So we became conditioned in the 50-minute class period to the bell with Sour Patch Kids. So,
Dang, I'm in.
yeah. So here's a video.
Hey, Psych 101 class. I'm David, and I'm going to be testing Pavlov's theory of classical conditioning on my roommate Brian. The conditioned stimulus will be the sound effect.
That was easy.
And then I'm going to shoot him with this airsoft gun. He will soon learn the relationship between the sound effect and the shot before it gets too hurt.
That was easy. That was easy.
Ah!
That was easy.
What?
That was easy. That was easy.
All right, guys, looks like Pavlov's theory worked.
Intense music. That would hurt his auditory.
I don't know if I can. I'm lecturing.
Actually, it's like bacon and green beans.
Just set it down for a second. Okay. Just gonna pause it. Okay, so the other type of learning is the operant learning, where the animal learns to associate behavior response with reward or punishment. And the most famous scientist with this was B.F. Skinner. So maybe you've heard of something called the Skinner box if you take psychology with Mrs. R. But Skinner box is basically a box and a rat is placed into it, and there's a lever. And if the rat, it presses the lever by accident, and a food pellet appears, and then pretty soon the rat associates the lever with food. And so then it learns that if I press this lever, that's behavioral response, it will get food, and that is the reward. And so I have a short video on that as well. So I think they used pigeon in this one.
What?
Turn. Yes.
Can pigeons read? This one gives every indication, because it's been taught to distinguish between two words and to behave appropriately. He's learned his different response to each sign by being rewarded with food. So the bird isn't acting independently. Its behavior is shaped by controlling its environment. The first task was to isolate an individual piece of behavior and see how that could be changed. Skinner did this by keeping individual pigeons at about 3/4 of their normal weight, so that the birds were always hungry and food could be used as an automatic
I feel
reward.
like that is abuse, but I'm not sure. Yeah, pretty much.
The pigeon was studied in a uniform box, one it quickly grew used to. One piece of behaviour, pecking a coloured disc, was measured on a graph. The pigeon learned that pecking the disc produced a reward. Then the behaviour of pecking could be studied in relation to how often that reward was offered, or in Skinner's terms, what was the schedule of reinforcement.
The main thing is what we call schedules of reinforcement. Reinforcement is what the layman calls
That's
reward, and you can schedule it so that a reward occurs every now and then when a pigeon does something. We usually use a response with a pigeon pecking a little disc, a little spot on the wall, and you can reinforce with food, but you don't reinforce every time. Perhaps every 10th time, or perhaps only once every minute or something like that. There are a very large number of schedules, and they have their special effects. And there is a good example of how you can move from the pigeon to the human case, because one of the schedules which is very effective with rats or pigeons is what we call the variable ratio schedule, and that is at the heart of all gambling devices and has the same effect. A pigeon can become a pathological gambler just as a person can. Now, the fact that we found that out with pigeons and could prove it by removing and changing the schedule makes it easy for us to interpret the case with the human subject. We don't say that the human subject gambles to punish himself, as the Freudians might say, or gambles because he feels excited when he does so. Nothing of the sort. People gamble because of the schedule of the reinforcement that follows, and this is true of all gambling systems. They all have variable ratios built into them. So what we've learned from the pigeon, it made it possible to interpret this vast field very effectively.
Where does that leave free will?
All right, I think it's like an 8-minute long movie, but you can associate it with gambling. So people that are that have a problem with gambling, it's mostly due to this operative learning. So, okay, moving on to the development of behavior. There are parent and offspring interactions in some organisms that influence its cognition as well as its behavior. And so we call this imprinting. Whereas the animal matures, maybe it has some kind of social attachment with other individuals, or maybe it develops a preference or some type of behavior that shows up later on in life. So we have filial imprinting, which means the social attachments between parents and offspring. Young birds tend to follow their mother. And so the most common, most famous behaviorologist was Konrad Lorenz. He was a German. He started to imprint geese onto himself. And you notice that geese will follow the object.
May I have your attention for today's announcements?
Okay, so now we're going to move on to imprinting in birds. And we were talking about Konrad Lorenz, who was a German behaviorologist. And what he did is he imprinted geese onto himself. Now, Harry Harlow, he looked at rhesus monkeys, infants particularly, and when you give them opportunity to form social attachments with two surrogate mothers, one was made of soft cloth, one was just made of wire, all infants chose the cloth even if the wire mother provided food. And so there's maybe some kind of texture, tactile contact rather than food that will promote some kind of social attachment. So I want to talk a little bit about an imprinting experiment that I did in college. And so in this experiment, we were given a mallard duck, a baby mallard duck, and our duck was named Ferdinand. And we were divided into 3 groups. Our entire biology class was divided into 3 groups, where one group, sorry about that, got interrupted. So we were divided into 3 groups. One group, we modeled or we imprinted our baby duck to a model duck that was on wheels. The second group, we modeled it to a tennis ball. And the third group, we modeled it to our tennis shoes. And so there are my tennis shoes. That's what my tennis shoes looked like when I was in college. And that was the group I was in. Each group, we were given ducks. Our ducks were in an isolated box. They were not with other baby ducks. In fact, they had never seen a baby duck before, so they really didn't know what they looked like. We would take the duck out. We put it into this little arena or this little cardboard ring, and we imprinted it to the mother. So the model duck, the tennis ball, or the tennis shoes. And we would quack, and we would just walk around and go quack, 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 quack. And we did this for weeks, okay? Several weeks. We had like schedules when to come in to care for our duck, clean it, feed it. You know, it was our responsibility to care for our duck, and if our duck died, we failed. So, I mean, like, we were just very, very nice to our duck. So anyways, at the very end of the weeks, we would introduce the duck to all 3 types of the surrogate mothers. And so, you know, we had Ferdinand in the ring, we walked in with our tennis shoes, and it was normal. We put Ferdinand back in the ring, and we put the model duck in there, and it started to freak out. Like, just quack into a corner and just like try to fly. It was horrible. And then we put the tennis ball on the string, and then it really lost its mind, you know, because it was like, what the hell is that, you know? But then the really sad thing is, we took another baby duck and we put it in the ring with Ferdinand, and this baby duck had been hanging out with other baby ducks, like, so it was a normal baby duck. And the baby duck's like, oh, look, another baby duck, and it was going towards it, and Ferdinand ran away from it. So Ferdinand had no idea what he looked like. But don't worry, there is a happy story to the end of Ferdinand here. Ferdinand was taken to a farm to relearn how to be a duck again, and it was fine. Okay, so there's a lot of research out there about how there's this biological need for stimulation. So we discussed the female rats. They lick their pups after birth. You know, it might inhibit the release of a chemical that can block normal growth. You know, so if it receives this tactile stimulation, there's more brain receptors, longer-lived neurons, greater tolerance for stress. It's very calm. If the mother doesn't take care of its young, then it becomes very startled very easily and scared, basically, of its environment, and highly stressed out. Premature human infants, for those that are born premature, if you massage it, then they tend to gain weight very rapidly. So there's some type of stimulation just really progresses the developments of these organisms. All right, there's also sexual imprinting that occurs mostly in birds. A lot of times with bird species, eggs are stolen from other nests, and for what reason, I'm not exactly sure. But what happens is that the individual that's taken or transferred directs its sexual behavior toward members of its own species. So we have this cross-fostering that takes place. Or we have one species raised by parents of a different species, and that bird that has been fostered will attempt to mate with members of its foster species when it is sexually mature. And sometimes it's successful and sometimes it's not. So, okay, there's other types of instinct and learning mechanisms, especially with bird songs. And so how do mates tend to serenade females? How do they learn to sing the song that it does? You know, is it instinct? Did it learn it? And so, you know, they believe that song, in this case, in male white crowned sparrows, are acquired by a combination of instinct and learning. So those that heard, sorry, that's a typo, no songs sing poorly versus those that had heard songs of their own species. And so what is there possibly a genetic template that guides them to learn the appropriate song? Who knows? Moving on to animal cognition. Some central questions is, okay, do animals show cognitive behavior? That means, do they show behavior that shows that they are actually processing information and they are responding in a manner that suggests that they are thinking? Kind of like in that short video with the pigeon, you know, can it really read? Does it read the sign turn or peck? And so some animals do exhibit cognitive behavior where they can actually solve problems. Chimpanzees, this is a no-brainer. They often use sticks as tools to eat their termites. Ravens are actually a very intelligent species. They are faster, you know, if you give them just a few tools, they can figure out how to get food. There's this great book out there called, oh gosh, what is it called? Mind of the Raven, and it's by Heinrich, German dude. He also writes the book Why We Run, which is an awesome book. Highly suggest you also check that one out. But he takes a closer look at ravens and you know, studies them and finds out that they are very, very intelligent birds, very intelligent species. Which leads me to this orientation of migratory behavior. How do some animals have the ability to travel, to nest, to know which watering hole they should go to? So we have orientation, which means they track stimuli in their environments. So some key words here. Taxis just means movement toward or away from a stimulus. So if it's a positive taxis, it means it moves toward. If it's a negative taxis, it moves away. So maybe you're looking at some kind of amoeba or some kind of water microscopic organism, and you expose it to a chemical, and maybe it starts to move towards the chemical. Maybe you think it's food, so you could say it's a positive taxis, it's moving towards this stimuli. Or maybe if you put a different compound in there where it moves away from it, then it would be a negative taxis. Okay. Migration, long-range two-way movements, where in the fall the birds migrate south and then they return in the spring. So migration, how do birds know when to migrate? Or you can think of salmon. How do they know where they were born? Or they always go back to the same spots. So that's very interesting to behaviorologists as well. So migrating birds must have this ability to orientate and navigate themselves. So navigation is just the ability to set or adjust the bearing and follow it. Birds and other mammals may look at the sun, so they know which way is north, east, south, west, as well as stars. There's this new study out there that shows that maybe they use the magnetic field. Maybe they have a kind of a sixth sense that they know the magnetic poles. All right, I think this is the last section here with animal communication. How do animals communicate with one another? So in order for animals to have a successful reproduction, they have to have the right signals and the right responses. And so we'll start with species recognition, where during courtship, they will produce signals to communicate with other potential mates. And so there's this stimulus-response change where the behavior of one releases a behavior by another individual. We also have long-distance communication, which means that chemical signals can mediate between males and females, and we call these chemical signals usually pheromones. And like with moths, female moths can release their pheromones, and the males can pick them up at very long distances and kind of home in, kind of like on a beacon or a trail, and follow it to the female moth. Communication can also facilitate group living. There's a lot of social groups of organisms out there, and so they need to be able to communicate information with one another. So honeybees tend to dance to communicate where to find food. Fruit flies, even though they're not social groups, but they also dance when they are during courtship. That's how they try to get the ladies. The males dance, and if the dance isn't good enough, the female will not mate with it. Primate language. Sometimes they will communicate with one another to identify specific predators that are in the area. Okay, so that is today's section. We will continue on with animal behavior part 2 tomorrow, where we'll talk about the blue-footed boobies and a few other key examples. Remember, Friday is the first day of presentations for the Human Body project. So for those that are chapter 43, I think it's Carlene Grace, you are up on Friday. Okay, that does it. Take care.